Hello my sea serpents, Seabro here, and today I will discuss how each of the three competitions I've talked about thus far in this series, namely Spam, Brawl and Dive, match up against each other. This is the first part of a three-part episode focusing on attacking and defending with Spam compositions. Let's jump straight into the video. We will touch on all of these in more detail when I talk specifically about lane control, chokes and stuff like that, so these will be a little bit brief. Having said that, it is going to get quite abstract and it's going to develop a little bit further than the previous episodes, and sometimes I know I'm bad at explaining stuff, especially abstract concepts, so if you are struggling to understand anything, then feel free to skip these 3 episodes and come back to them later. Anyways, before I start with specific composition matchups, I need to introduce you to a very useful graph, and that is this. This is a graph showing how each of the 3 base compositions have advantageous matchups against each other over time. Basically, each of the 3 compositions has a peak time period where it's at its strongest. Dive is really weak, but when they dive, when they first jump you, they are incredibly strong for a short period of time. And that's this massive peak in the middle, when they explode all of their cooldowns. Brawl starts off really strong, but as they use their cooldowns and their resources start to get depleted, they start to really struggle. And Spam is just consistent, they can fight all day, right? But it's important to understand this graph because it's ultra important in deciding how and when you want to play against the different compositions. Because you really want to take the fight, right? At a time when your composition has the advantage over the enemy. Anyways, without further ado, let's look at our first matchup, and that is Spam versus Spam. Obviously the graph I just mentioned doesn't really matter here, they both are as strong as each other at any moment in time. But as I have mentioned in episode 3, I think it was, of this series, what does matter is map control. As always, the defending team has the initial map control. A defending Spam composition can set up as usual, take all the sightlines they fancy. The attacking team, however, doesn't have this pleasure. They start off with Jack All. They need to look to gain the advantage in the fight, and they do this by cancelling out the enemy splits, whilst gaining map control for themselves. The Spam vs Spam matchup is all about this map control war. Spam vs Spam is like a massive game of domination from the Halo or Call of Duty franchises, if you have played either of those. The defending team starts off with all of the map control that they would like, and the attacking team needs to take each of these objectives, or splits, and they do this through advantageous fights. Imagine pushing with a full spam based composition and spamming out a Sigma, Ashe and Mercy. You're going to win that fight almost definitely, right? Because you have twice as many shields, twice as much damage and twice as much healing. Whilst initially, pushing with your full team is an option, as long as the group or split that you are using to try and force out the enemy has the advantage over them, that's what matters. You aren't going to force out a Sigma, Ashe and Mercy with just a Tracer. You might distract them, you might even force cooldowns, but you will be the one that ends up being forced out. The second option you have is mirroring splits. This effectively cancels out the enemy splits, but at the cost of losing some of your firepower. This doesn't gain you map control per se, but it does help prevent the enemy from pinching you. It's like chess, when both teams move 2 pawns close together, they kind of square up against each other. You just cancel out the 2 parts of both teams and they can't really do much. It's boring like that. Don't worry if I'm not making any sense, I'll give an example in a sec. But before I do, when you are the attacking team, you are looking for this kind of convex shape to your map control. And having this means you are pretty happy because you'll have the angles on the enemy. In fact, in open maps, you sometimes end up with this flanking nonsense going on where both teams, left and right flanks, spread further and further away from their team because they're trying to get this convex positioning. Anyways, example time. This is a game between Spark and NYXL. Obviously, NYXL are running a dive spam hybrid composition, but when the Brawl Tracer aren't engaging, then they have this spam playstyle, so it works for this example. On this section of the map, there are 3 paths. I'll call them lanes. You have the left lane, the middle lane, and the right lane. NYXL start off really spread out, controlling all 3 lanes. Flora on the Tracer and Yukpung on Brawl both push these flank lanes, the left and the right lane, to try and get this convex shape. Architect on the Tracer for Spark then effectively mirrors that split to stop Flora getting that angle. And you'll find that this happens constantly because neither team wants to give up that flank. you end up with this Nash equilibrium where both teams' tracers need to keep each other busy, because if one tries to push a different lane, then that will give the opportunity for the enemy tracer to push to that lane. Currently on the middle lane, Spark push with a pretty hefty advantage, so the Sigma and Brig have to fall back to the cute little toilet cubicle thing. But because Spark push so hard in the middle lane, they open up the right lane for NYXL's Hammond player to push through. And because Spark commit so hard to the middle lane, this gives Excelsior beautiful angles on them. Obviously a gravitic flux is involved, but look at this angle. Even without the flux, by pushing the middle lane so hard without neutralising or forcing out the flank lanes, they make life pretty difficult for themselves. I hope this makes sense. In summary, you want to pressure out the enemy splits while setting up your own splits to gain more map control than the enemy. Importantly though, you usually want to push out the flank lanes, the sides, because if you push mid, the straight down mid off the bat, you will give the enemy this free convex structure that is really powerful with spam. If that doesn't make sense, then leave a comment down below, but now let's move on to spam versus dive. Let's quickly refer back to our useful graph. Here we see that spam have the advantage over all of the time except this little peak in the middle, which is shortly after the enemy dive composition has initiated their dive. Because of this, the defending spam composition wants to keep the fight in the early part of the graph, whilst they have the advantage. The dive composition is going to be moving across the map, taking high ground and getting into position to dive, doing their pesky little dive stuff, and it's during this phase that you can really abuse them. To do this, you gain map control and you can use this really useful ability called Bolt. Chucking cooldowns like Dynamite, Echo Bombs, Ignite right clicks, Tracer Pulse Bombs, Junkrat Bombs, Roadhog Hooks, Sigma Accretion, in fact pretty much any damage ability in the game can really peeve the enemy off. Timing this whilst they are rotating and chucking some primary fire their way can make it very hard for them to set up. Here is a quick example of how you want to punish the enemy whilst they are trying to set up. This is a game between Seoul Dynasty and Guangzhou Charge. Charge are trying to set up for a dive, but notice how Tracer is harassing this angle. Dive compositions cannot commit to a dive until Winston is on full HP and they have all of their cooldowns, and Prophet knows this, he's the one on the Tracer. I also really want to emphasize this, right? It's really important that you discuss ahead of time who you are going to be targeting, and cannot stress this enough. Often rotations for dive based compositions are fairly short, and your window of opportunity to punish them doesn't last long. If your target caller calls Winston, then by the time your DPS hear that, process it, locate the Winston and then start shooting, the moment is already passed. This also applies for when dive actually initiates a dive, right? It's really important you do everything you can to shoot the same target as quickly as possible after they have entered your line of sight. If you miss that half a second opportunity window, then that's enough time for dive to get on top of you with all their cooldowns and all their health, and you're going to struggle. Moving on to map control. I know I've talked previously about how spam love map control, and spoilers, this video is on spam, so it's going to be thrown around quite a lot. But to gain that map control, they usually play split, right? Against dive, you have to be really careful with your splits, because you need to make sure that each split is effectively dive proof. This could be that they are positioned too far away to get dived, it could be that the heroes have a lot of survivability, or it could be that the split has enough mobility that they can get out if they are jumped. Either way, you don't want to hand the enemy a great dive opportunity. You want your splits to be in a position to help the other heroes in the team if they get dived. In the example I showed about 10 seconds ago, you will notice that Dynasty are positioned really far back, or at least their backline is positioned really far back, where Charge cannot directly dive them. When you actually get dived, that's when micro stuff becomes important. Individual positioning and mortality field usage and target focus, for example, are all really important. You need to try and keep alive until dive runs out of sustain, in other words, they use all of their cooldowns and can't stay there anymore without dying. But the easiest way by a mile to defend against a dive composition is to damage their composition before they can even engage. Moving on to attacking a spam. Against a dive composition, it can be really difficult. Boy, do you have your work cut out. It's really not easy on most maps because dive can engage you really easily whilst you try to rotate. You can substitute some anti-dive heroes and play a spam Brawl hybrid and just play like a Brawl composition if you're struggling, but if you are insistent on playing a pure spam composition, then you need to be really careful with your pathing. You want to avoid giving the enemy opportunities to dive your backline. It's okay if your tanks are diveable, that's totally fine, but if your backline are diveable before you have set up in a strong location, then they will really struggle. Similarly to playing against a spam composition, you want to slowly take key locations and gain map control. But importantly, it has to be kind of your tanks that take the aggressive angle, right? And your backline takes this passive angle. And it's important that both of these angles have line of sight of each other. I'll give you an example because this is a little bit complicated. This is Dynasty versus Hunters on Junkertown. Sorry that all of these examples are on the same map. It's the only real map that's getting played at the moment with spam. Anyways, Hunters are attacking Dynasty's dive composition with spam. But notice how the Orisa is the one touching point, playing the aggressive angle. Sigma and Brig also take a bit of an angle too, but the Squishies, they are all playing in an undiveable location where they are pretty safe, but also in line of sight of the tanks. This is because spam really need to play split to gain map control, that is needed to prevent the enemy successfully diving them, but they also need to bait the dive onto their tanks because they can gain support from their team. It kind of makes sense, right? Because an Ana, a Moira, a Baptiste, any of your flex healers, they can't pill for themselves as well as they can pill for somebody else on their team, preferably their tanks. Anyways, that is spam versus dive completed. Now let's talk about spam versus brawl. You're doing great. Well done for keeping up with me this long. We are nearly finished, but now I want to divert our attention back to our handy graph. We can see that brawl has the advantage early on, but if spam can prolong the fight, then they have the advantage. And most of the time they can just do this by keeping the distance from the brawl composition. When defending a spam against brawl, you often look to punish them mid-rotation. Often if you're playing with an Orisa, then a hold combo can be useful to get picks. Alternatively, just melting down the enemy shields can be really powerful, especially if they are taking long rotations. You've got to remember, a Reinhardt shield has a HP of 1600 at the time of making this video anyways, and that lasts no time at all with 6 people shooting at it. But as they try to close the distance, you can just back up and keep the distance and repeat. You often end up with this like ring of roses circular motion going on where you keep backing up, whereas this brawl composition keep trying to push forward to get to you. If you are forced to brawl them though, maybe because they are contesting point or because they have managed to close that distance, then you want it to be the Orisa, if you have one, that engages them. Because whilst being pocketed by both healers with an immortality fill ready and Orisa's fortify, she is very capable at surviving for a long period of time. And the longer that you can draw out the fight, the bigger the spam composition's advantage is. Diverting our attention to attacking with spam, you often want to take high ground to avoid chokes. Because brawl just are phenomenal at choke points, right? And you also usually don't have to worry about the enemy team's abilities to break your shields, so you can pretty much play really split and slowly surround the enemy until you get a pick or they are forced out. You're pretty free with the splits that you take, right? Because a brawl composition's ability to punish you long range is fairly minimal, but you do have to be aware of how far away you are. Brawl is like a rabid dog on a leash. If they get too close to you, then they will eat your head off your body, right? Because they probably have a Lucio speed boost to run you down. Unless you have mobility to jump out as soon as the rabid dog starts barking, you will probably need to keep plenty of distance. But the key to this matchup is actually really simple. As long as you keep your distance, as spam, against brawl, you are absolutely golden. And as long as you remember that, you can't go too far wrong. Anyways, that is it for this video. I bet you're glad I'm finished. These concepts can get pretty complicated, but I'll talk more about these matchups in separate videos as we talk about more specific concepts. There are 2 more parts to this episode where I talk about dives matchups and brawls matchups, but for now, that is me done. Well done on listening to me ramble on for so long. Now hopefully I'll see you in the next video. So have a great day. Cbro out.